What if Hitler had won World War II? In the summer of 1940, Britain stood at a crossroads. A powerful faction within Winston Churchill's government seriously considered negotiating peace with Nazi Germany. That same year, by September, the Royal Air Force was nearly broken. A narrow defeat in the skies could have paved the way for a full-scale German invasion of the British Isles. Fast forward to October 1941, Moscow itself was teetering. German troops had advanced to within 40 miles of the Soviet capital, while panic spread through the streets. At each of these critical junctures, history was only a decision, or a single event, away from a radically different outcome. Had even one of these events tipped in Hitler's favor, the trajectory of the 20th century might have been unrecognizable. Hitler's dream of European domination and perhaps global conquest was far from fantasy. It was frighteningly close to realization. But what kind of world would have followed? Historian Gerhard L. Weinberg, in his compelling work Visions of Victory, explored the distinct post-war blueprints imagined by the major leaders of the Second World War. Of these, it was Franklin D. Roosevelt's vision that most closely aligned with the world order that ultimately emerged after 1945. In contrast, Hitler's vision for a Nazi-dominated planet was not only dystopian, it was endless. His long-term strategy, as Weinberg outlines, did not stop with victory in Europe. A Nazi win in World War II would likely have led to an unending series of global conflicts, World War III, World War IV, and beyond, each bringing Germany closer to absolute dominance over the earth. This chilling alternate history is not just a thought experiment. It is a reminder of how fragile civilization can be when tyrants stand on the edge of power. Hitler's vision for a post-war world. Had Nazi Germany achieved victory in Europe, Hitler's plans for territorial expansion and racial engineering would have redrawn the global map and reshaped human civilization in horrifying ways. In the immediate aftermath of his triumph, Hitler intended to directly annex countries he viewed as suitably Nordic and racially compatible with his ideology. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, along with the German-speaking region of Switzerland, would have been absorbed into the Reich. These regions were to be fully integrated as part of a broader Aryan empire. To the east, the brutal occupation system already in place in Poland, known as the General Government, would have expanded deep into the former Soviet Union, stretching as far east as the 70th meridian. This area, covering more than half of the Russian Empire, was not to be developed or civilized, but rather transformed into a vast reservoir of expendable slave labor. Millions of Slavs were to be displaced, enslaved, or eliminated, as Nazi ideology viewed them as racially inferior. Japan, Hitler's Axis partner, would have temporarily received control over the remaining eastern portions of the Soviet Union. But this too would have been subject to Germany's long-term ambitions, which aimed at global hegemony, even at the expense of its allies. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini would have been allowed to fulfill his dream of restoring the Roman Empire, but only under German supervision. Hitler had no intention of ceding strategic dominance. France and Great Britain, including Ireland, were to remain under Nazi control, while Spain and Portugal would function as puppet states, firmly within the German sphere of influence. In Africa, Hitler planned to reclaim Germany's former colonial possessions lost after World War I and take over the rest of the continent from the defeated European powers. He anticipated an alliance with the Afrikaner regime in South Africa, whose racial policies mirrored Nazi ideology. In Hitler's mind, a pro-Nazi South Africa would serve as a foothold for wider German control over sub-Saharan Africa. The genocidal ambitions of the Nazi regime would not stop with Europe. The final solution, the planned eradication of Jews, would have expanded across every territory under German influence. But Hitler's long-term vision went even further. Christianity was marked for eventual destruction, as the Nazis sought to replace it with a secular, authoritarian state ideology rooted in racial myth. Perhaps most disturbingly, Hitler planned to institute policies to manipulate Germany's demographic future. Following wars expected to kill over 4 million German soldiers, the regime intended to adopt state-sponsored polygamy, allowing surviving men to father children with multiple women in order to repopulate the nation and maintain Aryan dominance. This was not merely conquest, It was a blueprint for a nightmarish new world order, governed by an ideology of racial supremacy, permanent war, and totalitarian control over every aspect of life. Hitler's grand strategy and the fate of the United States. Despite their prominence in the Axis alliance, Hitler viewed both Italy and Japan as strategic tools, temporary instruments of war, not long-term equals. While fascist Italy under Mussolini might have been allowed to maintain its revived Roman Empire under German oversight, Japan's fate was starkly different. In Hitler's vision, Japan was to serve a functional role: conquer China, subdue Southeast Asia, claim Australasia, seize the Central Pacific, and dismantle the eastern half of the Soviet Union. But once these goals were accomplished, Japan too was to be discarded, conquered in turn by Germany. This vision of betrayal was characteristic of Hitler's worldview. Allies were mere stepping stones to global domination. Yet even this ruthless vision had one glaring gap: how to defeat the United States. Historian Gerhard L. Weinberg noted that Nazi Germany never developed a clear, coherent plan to eliminate America. The reason? Hitler's deep-seated racial contempt for the United States. He dismissed Americans as a mongrel race, an unstable, fragmented society incapable of standing against the supposed military superiority of Aryan Germany. He believed internal divisions would cause the U.S. to collapse under its own weight, and that its multicultural society lacked the discipline and cohesion to mount a meaningful resistance. This fatal underestimation was not just a tactical oversight, it was a direct consequence of Hitler's obsession with racial ideology. As late as the autumn of 1944, even as American troops flooded Europe, outproducing every other Allied nation in tanks, aircraft, artillery, and manpower, Hitler still regarded Britain, not the United States, as his most dangerous opponent in the West. By then, it was U.S. industry and military aid that sustained the global fight against the Axis. From the Soviet front to the Pacific, American support was the backbone of the Allied war effort. Yet Hitler remained blind to this reality, clinging to a delusional worldview shaped more by prejudice than by pragmatism. This blindness also warped his military strategy. Originally, Hitler had intended to finish off Western Europe before confronting the Soviet Union. His infamous non-aggression pact with Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was designed to buy time. But when he broke that agreement in June 1941, launching Operation Barbarossa, he opened a two-front war that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Had he stuck to his original plan, conquering all of Western Europe first, then turned the full, undivided might of the German war machine eastward, the outcome might have been dramatically different. A German empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains was not beyond the realm of possibility. And had the U.S. remained isolated, distracted, or underestimated long enough, Hitler's long-term goal, the conquest of the entire globe, might have taken its next horrifying step. The flaws in Hitler's global strategy. Even if Hitler's dream of conquering Europe and weakening the United States had materialized, his long-term strategy, to seize the world piecemeal, was fundamentally flawed. And the flaw lay not in military logistics, but in the hubris of assuming absolute control over ever-shifting alliances. Hitler appeared to believe that Japan, like Italy, would remain endlessly loyal to the Axis cause, dutifully maintaining its war against China and the United States until Germany was ready to turn on its own allies. This assumption reflected not just strategic miscalculation, but a profound failure to grasp geopolitical reality. Imperial Japan, despite its cooperation with Nazi Germany, was never truly a kindred regime. While both were militaristic, authoritarian states with expansionist ambitions, their partnership was one of necessity, not trust. Japanese leaders were acutely aware that Nazi ideology was built on racial supremacy, and that Japan's status as honorary Aryans was a diplomatic fiction masking deep-seated contempt. The very phrase, honorary Aryans, illustrates the ideological contradictions within the Axis alliance. For a regime obsessed with racial purity, making such an exception was less a sign of acceptance and more an acknowledgement of Japan's temporary usefulness. But history has repeatedly shown that alliances built on convenience are fragile. Examples abound. In 1866, Austria and Prussia went to war in the so-called Bruderkrieg, only to form the dual alliance just 13 years later. In World War I, Italy began as a member of the Central Powers, but ultimately joined the Allies. In World War II, Italy again reversed course, switching sides in 1943 after Mussolini's fall. Even more strikingly, just a decade after the fall of the Third Reich, West Germany became a key ally of the United States within NATO, an organization created to resist the very expansionist totalitarianism Hitler once embodied. Had Nazi Germany triumphed in Europe and begun preparing to dominate its Axis partners, a split with Japan would have been inevitable. Given the ideological incompatibilities and the likelihood of Japanese resistance to becoming a German satellite, a new conflict, perhaps even a world war between former Axis partners, would likely have erupted. This contradiction at the heart of Hitler's world conquest plan reveals not only a failure of strategic foresight but also the self-defeating nature of a regime rooted in racial arrogance and absolute power. Even in victory, Hitler's empire would have been inherently unstable. The limits of Nazi power and the triumph of resistance. In the end, Hitler's vision of global domination, though terrifyingly close at times, was ultimately doomed by its own overreach. Before Nazi Germany could ever achieve its final objective of world conquest, the sheer scale of its threat would have unified the rest of the world against it. Ideological and political differences would have been set aside in the face of a common enemy that promised nothing less than a totalitarian nightmare on a planetary scale. Even if Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia had fallen under Nazi control, projecting power across the vast expanses of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would have proven a monumental challenge. Germany's industrial capabilities and naval infrastructure, while formidable, were never sufficient to support global military logistics on the scale Hitler envisioned. At best, Germany might have developed a long-range bombing program. Indeed, Nazi engineers conceptualized the America bomber, a massive aircraft designed to fly one-way missions across the Atlantic. Its most extreme iteration imagined not just bombing American targets but intentionally crashing into skyscrapers in New York City, eerily foreshadowing the tactics of future generations of extremists. But the United States was far from defenseless. Even before the war's end, it was already preparing for such a scenario. Development of the Convair B-36 Peacemaker began in 1941, a direct response to fears that Hitler would overrun all of Europe. This six-engine intercontinental bomber was capable of striking Berlin from bases in northeastern Canada, giving the U.S. unmatched reach. The prototype took to the skies in 1946, and by 1948, the U.S. not only had an operational B-36 fleet, but also possessed over 50 atomic bombs. Meanwhile, Germany's nuclear program lagged far behind. Scientific disorganization, ideological interference, and Allied sabotage ensured that the Nazis never came close to building a viable atomic weapon. When faced with a nuclear-armed superpower thousands of miles away, protected by oceans and equipped with bombers that could level entire cities, Hitler's so-called master race would have been no match. In the end, the world Hitler envisioned would not have lasted. It would have burned beneath the very fire he helped unleash. Alternate histories remind us not only of what could have happened, but how narrowly humanity escaped catastrophe. Nazi Germany came dangerously close to reshaping the world in its own brutal image. But arrogance, underestimation, and resistance from unlikely corners ultimately shattered that ambition. If you found this deep dive into alternate history fascinating, subscribe to History Love for more thought-provoking explorations of the past that could have been. From pivotal battles to lost empires, we bring history to life with depth, detail, and critical insight. Like, comment, and share to keep history alive. Because to understand what was, we must imagine what might have been.